I've been watching the Oscars every year since I was 12 years old. Every year, I pay attention to the major titles that are in the race, I make my predictions, and I follow the precursor awards in the build-up to the big night. Now, does this mean that I think the Oscars are the be-all and end-all of determining cinematic quality, and that they always make the right decisions? Hell no. There's absolutely no denying that the Academy's track record is spotty, to be generous about it. Sometimes movies that go on to be influential classics get no attention from them, sometimes they award movies that make them feel good over the ones that are actually artistically interesting, and sometimes they just make indefensibly bad choices like declaring this to be the best editing of the year 2018. Hell, my favourite movie from last year didn't even get so much as a nomination. So then, why do I still pay attention to the Oscars every year? Well, the simple answer is that it's just fun for me, a bit like people who get really invested in watching reality game shows. I enjoy getting swept up in the spirit of award season, rooting for the performances and movies that I love, and sometimes actually seeing the right people get awarded, because yes, that does happen sometimes, and it feels really good when it does. Do I wish they'd get it right more often? Of course. I'd love to live in the universe where Stanley Kubrick has more Oscars than the director of Dumb and Dumber 2. But for what it's worth, as the Academy's membership has diversified and younger, more forward-thinking voices have joined their ranks, I do think their taste has at least become more interesting than it once was. The definition of what is and isn't an Oscar movie becoming increasingly hard to nail down. They'll still make decisions that drive me insane, but at least now movies like Drive My Car and The Zone of Interest can make it into the Best Picture lineup, something that would have been almost unthinkable 15 years ago. So with that in mind, I thought it would be fun to do a ranking video for every Best Picture winner of this century. That is, movies that won Best Picture and were released from the year 2000 onwards. So American Beauty doesn't count, even though, yes, it technically did win Best Picture in the 21st century. The titles here range in quality from straight up bad to genuine masterpiece, so it's the perfect subject for a ranking video. I'll also be telling you in each case whether I think the movie in question deserved to win Best Picture, and if not, then what I would have chosen from the lineup instead. As always, this list is completely 100% objective, and if you disagree with any of my takes, then you are just dumb and wrong, because my word is final, and that's that. So there. To the surprise of probably no one, coming in at the bottom is Crash. Not the David Cronenberg one, of course. This is a classic example of a movie whose legacy is defined pretty much entirely by what it beat at the Oscars. It was obvious that Brokeback Mountain was the defining film of that year. A big critical and commercial success that was a landmark in the history of queer cinema. But of course, 2005 Academy voters just weren't ready to give Best Picture to a movie about gay cowboys, so they went with a movie about another important social issue instead. And I think Jack Nicholson's delivery when he's reading out the result says it all.
And the Oscar goes to Crash.
The best way I can describe Crash is that it's probably the favourite movie of Bradley Whitford's character from Get Out. It's supposedly an examination of racial tensions in post-9/11 America, but its grand thesis simply boils down to racism is bad. It's melodramatic, it's condescending, and the characters flat out state the themes of the movie in incredibly on-the-nose monologues that only a 13-year-old would find deep.
Man, look around you, man. You couldn't find a whiter, safer, or better lit part of this city right now. But yet this white woman sees two black guys who look like UCLA students strolling down the sidewalk, and her reaction is blind fear?
Also, Matt Dillon plays a cop who's just a complete racist asshole the entire movie, and at one point he molests a black woman that he pulled over under false pretenses, but then later he saves her from dying in a car crash, and I guess we're meant to understand that he's been redeemed now? Yeah, this movie blows. It would be bad even if it hadn't beaten Brokeback Mountain, but the fact that it did just makes it so much more aggravating.
I wish I knew how to quit you.
Oh boy, another movie about racism made by and for white people. Green Book is definitely a more enjoyable movie than Crash, but once again it completely fails as an examination of racism. Basically it's sort of a race-swapped Driving Miss Daisy where Viggo Mortensen plays an Italian-American guy from the Bronx who becomes the chauffeur for a black musician played by Mahershala Ali. Along the way, Viggo learns to be less racist and Mahershala learns to loosen up a little bit. Well boys, we did it. Racism is no more. Green Book is just one of the most frustrating Best Picture winners, I think, ever. Coming right off two genuinely cool winners that seemed to indicate the Academy's tastes were evolving and becoming more interesting, they gave it to exactly the kind of middle-brow Oscar bait that they regularly awarded in the 1980s. Again, it's not as obnoxious as Crash. It actually does have its charms as a mismatched buddy comedy with solid lead performances. Viggo Mortensen is very good as Paulie from The Sopranos, and Mahershala Ali injects much more depth into his character than the script does. They definitely play off each other well, but ultimately it's impossible to get past how insultingly simplistic the movie's handling of racism is, with some lines that I just can't believe came from a major studio film released in 2018.
What, I can't get mad at that stuff he was saying because I ain't black? Christ, I'm blacker than you are.
And that's before we even get into how the family of the man Mahershala Ali's character is based on condemned the movie for misrepresenting him, and nobody involved in the production ever reached out to them for consultation. Still, I guess it wasn't the worst Best Picture nominee from that year. So, what should have won Best Picture that year? Well, my personal choice would probably be The Favourite, but the other obvious answer is Roma, which seemed like the frontrunner for most of that season and would have been an amazing winner. Or, if the Academy really wanted to award a movie that tackles racism, they could have gone with BlacKkKlansman, a movie by a black director which doesn't sugarcoat racism for the benefit of white audiences or treat it as something that the country is rid of, and is also generally just way more formally interesting than Green Book. The only good thing to come out of Green Book's Best Picture win was Spike Lee's reaction to it on the red carpet afterwards.
Are you British?
Yeah.
Are you British?
I am.
Let me give you a British answer. It was my cup of tea. Not my cup of tea!
2001 was a banger year for film. You had Mulholland Drive, Moulin Rouge, AI, Amelie, The Royal Tenenbaums, The Fellowship of the Ring, In the Mood for Love and Memento released in the United States that year. On the animation side of things, there was Shrek and Monsters, Inc. And then there were all these other movies that I'm told are also great, but I haven't seen yet. So of course, out of that crop, the movie that won Best Picture was A Beautiful Mind. This isn't a terrible movie, but it's just such a bland and forgettable winner in a year with so many superior options. It's basically a very standard biopic about a tortured genius that hits all the typical beats you'd expect, right down to a schmaltzy ending where the lead actor is put in old age makeup for a scene where the character delivers a speech before a crowd of people who give him a big applause. You know, that trope they make fun of in I'm Thinking of Ending Things. In fact, the I'm Thinking of Ending Things scene is very explicitly a subtweet of this specific movie. It's also a rather cliched and melodramatic portrayal of mental illness that sees John Nash's struggles with schizophrenia as little more than a vehicle for Russell Crowe to do some capital A acting. I'd probably go with Moulin Rouge out of this lineup. It wouldn't have been a universally beloved winner by any means, but its full-hearted explosion of excess would have made it a bolder, more interesting choice than A Beautiful Mind. And it actually came surprisingly close to pulling it off with a win at the Producers Guild Awards. If only the Academy had been so adventurous that year. Regardless of whether or not you're invested in the Oscar race, it's pretty hard to argue with the fact that winning one is a pretty big deal for someone in the industry. After all, it's nice when your work gets a seal of approval from peers in your field, and they can provide a huge boost to the careers and profiles of those who win them. But the flip side, as we'll see a few times throughout this video, is that winning an Oscar can also be something of a curse. There are times when winning Best Picture can actually have a negative effect on a movie's reputation, forever saddling it with the expectations that come with being a Best Picture winner and forcing people to judge it more harshly than they otherwise might have. The ultimate example of this might just be Kota. A perfectly nice, heartwarming little movie whose legacy now forever carries the asterisk of, but it really shouldn't have won Best Picture. This movie's path to winning Best Picture was one of the weirder ones that I've seen in recent memory. It was pretty much in the conversation for the entire year following its Sundance premiere, but most people just had it in the lower tier of their predictions, and some didn't even have it in their 10 at all. When award season actually started, it seemed like the big title in play was The Power of the Dog. Kota only received 3 nominations, none of which were for directing or editing. Then it won the Screen Actors Guild Award for Best Cast, and the BAFTA for Best Adapted Screenplay, and then the Producers Guild Award for Best Picture. And then, after only like 3 weeks of people taking it seriously as a contender, it won Best Picture. It truly felt like this movie just came out of nowhere as the frontrunner, defying pretty much every stat you can think of in terms of predicting the Oscars. And now, outside of that one joke in the final season of Barry, nobody really talks about it? I absolutely think this is a better movie than Green Book, but it's similarly frustrating in how clear it was that voters went with the movie that made them cry over the more artistically interesting uses of the cinematic medium that came out that year. Again, Kota is a nice movie. It's very well acted, and it's hard not to be moved by the final act, which I think is what made a lot of people vote for it. But you can tell where pretty much every scene is going, the filmmaking is competent but not especially noteworthy, and it generally just feels like a really solid Disney Channel original movie, not a film that wins Hollywood's highest honor. If it hadn't won, or if its only win had been Best Supporting Actor for Troy Kotsur, who is excellent in it, I'd think of it as that nice little movie from a couple of years ago. Instead, it feels destined to make future generations say, Coda? What the fuck is Coda? When they look up what won Best Picture in 2021 over The Power of the Dog, Dune, Drive My Car, Licorice Pizza, or my personal choice West Side Story, all of which were much better options from that lineup. "2008 will always go down in Oscars history as the year that The Dark Knight failed to receive a Best Picture nomination, prompting the Academy to expand the number of nominees from 5 to 10 in an effort to give less traditionally Oscar-y movies more of a chance. If not for it being the catalyst for such a significant change, I really don't think this is a lineup we would be talking about very often. It's 4 movies that are just kind of fine, and one that, quite frankly, does not exist. So anyway, Slumdog Millionaire? Yeah, it's fine. This is one of those Best Picture winners where I can kind of see why it might have captured a lot of people's hearts at the time with its feel-good story, but 15 years on, it's kind of mind-boggling to think that it has the highest win total of any Best Picture from the last 2 decades. It really feels like a relic from another time in so many ways, from its aggressively late 2000s aesthetic to the way the entire plot hinges on who wants to be a millionaire. Launching Dev Patel's career has really been its longest-lasting cultural legacy. I really don't know what I'd pick from this lineup. I guess The Curious Case of Benjamin Button is the most cinematically interesting, but I think Milk is the one that I like the best. As annoying as comic book fans often are, I'm gonna have to concede to them that yes, The Dark Knight is indeed better than the 4 movies that I've seen from this lineup. The Artist is another movie that would be much more fondly remembered if it hadn't won Best Picture. It's a very charming tribute to the silent film era made with obvious affection, but that's kind of just it. Narratively, it's basically just a riff on A Star Is Born and Singin' in the Rain. So how did it take the Oscars by storm, you ask? Well, in order to answer that question, I'm gonna have to talk about this piece of shit. Now that he's deservedly disgraced and rotting his days away in a prison cell, it's easy to forget just how much power Harvey Weinstein held over the Oscar race pre-2017. He'd employ ruthless and frequently unethical tactics during Oscar campaigns for films he produced, and sometimes those tactics would pay off for him. With The Artist, he took what was essentially a charming piece of fluff that was warmly received at Cannes and managed to paint it as a triumphant symbol of the magic of the movies that was worthy of being named Cinematic Achievement of the Year. The result was that it basically swept that entire award season, winning almost every precursor award, even from critics groups, and coming away with 5 wins on the big night. There's a lot to like about The Artist. It features 2 wonderfully charismatic performances from Jean Dujardin and Bernice Bigeaud. I really like the score, and that one dream sequence where sounds can be heard but the main character remains silent is a very clever and effective way of playing around with the form. Also, the dog low-key should have won Best Supporting Actor. But it's another example of a movie whose Best Picture winner status places unreasonable expectations on it. It's really just a charming little formal experiment and not much beyond that. Looking at this lineup, my vote would have gone to Terrence Malick's ambitious and impressionistic The Tree of Life. As an Irish person, I'm not exactly the biggest fan of the British royal family, or really the concept of monarchy in general. With that being said, I don't hate the King's Speech. Colin Firth is pretty excellent in it, I enjoy the dynamic between his character and Geoffrey Rush's, and I do find there's a certain charmingly quaint quality to these British period dramas for grandparents that I find somewhat cozy. Tom Hooper's eccentric directing style, with his strange compositions that often places actors to the extreme left or right of the frame, is pretty hit or miss for me, although I think it works better here than in, say, Les Mis. Of course, the fact that this movie beat The Social Network is just an absolute travesty, something that has only become more apparent with time. Obviously, voters in 2010 couldn't have foreseen just how prescient and timelessly relevant David Fincher's masterpiece would prove to be, but it still should have been clear from the beginning that it was the best film of that year, and deserved to win over what's essentially a glorified BBC original movie, from the twisted mind who would go on to bring us Cats 2019. King's Speech is an enjoyable film, but maybe one of the ultimate examples of the Academy at their least adventurous. It's easy to see why Argo appealed so much to awards voters. Released in the middle of the Obama administration, it's basically a movie about how cool and badass America is, not to mention a story in which Hollywood essentially gets to save the day. There's certainly a lot to critique about it, not least the way it distorts the facts of its true story to make the CIA seem like the real heroes. But if it's essentially a piece of jingoistic propaganda, I won't deny that it's an entertaining one. It's a fun little thriller with a lot of great supporting parts for some of Hollywood's best character actors, and a script that incorporates fairly self-congratulatory but also amusingly self-deprecating in-jokes about Hollywood and the movie business. More than anything, it's a solid showcase for Ben Affleck as a director. I've seen this twice, and both times I found myself getting stressed for pretty much the entire final half hour, despite knowing the ultimate outcome of the story, which certainly speaks to his skill at crafting tension. With all that said, I wouldn't call it a best picture. Of the films I've seen from this lineup, none really stick out to me as an obvious choice for the winner, but I think Lincoln would probably be the one I'd go with. Given that COVID forced every movie scheduled for release in 2020 to either get delayed or dumped on a streaming service, the movie that won Best Picture that year was always going to have an asterisk next to its legacy. With that being said, I still think Nomadland is pretty good, although it's not a movie that I have very strong feelings towards either way. It's nicely shot, appreciably earnest, Frances McDormand is very good, and it was cool to see such an understated performance win Best Actress. Nevertheless, there's an argument to be made that the movie's portrayal of people living under economic hardship is a little too romanticized, a symptom of the film's internal tension between being a docudrama about those left behind by late capitalism and a fictional story about a woman played by a recognizable actor who finds inner peace by embracing the nomadic lifestyle. It's fine, and I have a lot of respect for Chloe Zhao as an artist, but this just isn't a movie I feel terribly compelled to revisit. Choosing a winner from that lineup is a bit hard. I like David Fincher's Mank a lot more than most, and it's probably my favourite of these 8 if I'm being honest. But I do think The Father is probably the filmmaking achievement that stands out the most, so I might go with that. But hey, I'm glad that they went with Nomadland over The Trial of the Chicago 7. When I started working on this video, Million Dollar Baby was one of 2 21st Century Best Picture winners that I hadn't seen yet. I really didn't know much about it, just that it was a boxing movie directed by Clint Eastwood, starring himself alongside Hilary Swank and Morgan Freeman, both of whom won acting Oscars for it. For the first half, the movie was more or less exactly what I expected. A fairly standard sports movie about an ambitious underdog fighting for their dream with help from a grizzled mentor with whom they form a close bond. But then in the second half, a major plot development turns the movie into something much more depressing, though still compelling and well acted. Eastwood definitely goes for your heartstrings in the final stretch, but thankfully he never kicks the sentimentality into overdrive. And while the film certainly does end on an ethically questionable note, I do think the choice made is in character for both of the leads, regardless of whether or not it's the morally correct one. In terms of what I would have chosen for Best Picture that year, well, out of the 5 nominees, my preference would be Sideways, although as good as that movie is, it really doesn't feel like a Best Picture winner either. But yeah, Million Dollar Baby. Maybe not the best movie of 2004, but still worth watching. The Hurt Locker was the other movie on this list that I hadn't seen prior to starting the video. Famously, this was the movie that made Kathryn Bigelow the first and, until recently, only woman to receive the Oscar for Best Director, and it's easy to see why. From the first scene, Bigelow manages to place us vividly in the chaotic headspace of her characters, the jerky handheld shaky cam and frequent zooms capturing the chaotic intensity that they're living through in every moment. Similar to Nolan's Dunkirk, this is less a movie about the political context of its central war than an up-close look at the sheer terror of living through it. It's also a very interesting character study of a man addicted to the thrill of risking his life, who feels more content in the hellish throes of war than in the quiet suburban life waiting for him back home. A Serious Man is definitely my favourite movie from the 2009 Best Picture lineup. It's one of my favourite Coen Brothers movies, and the fact that it actually managed to get nominated is one of the best arguments in favour of expanding the lineup from 5 to 10, because that would not have happened in a year of 5. But I accept that A Serious Man was never going to win, and while I certainly appreciate Avatar much more than I used to, I think The Hurt Locker is a solid, satisfying choice. Gladiator is the earliest released film on this list, and overall I'd say it still holds up. It doesn't reinvent the wheel, nor does it try to. It's a very effective throwback to the Hollywood swords and sandals epics of a bygone era, one that doesn't strive for depth or surprise but delivers spectacle in spades, with Ridley Scott's camera capturing the majesty of the Roman Empire in all its mythical glory. The characterization is extremely straightforward and simplistic, as is the exploration of the political machinations within ancient Rome, but it's to the credit of Russell Crowe's commanding movie star performance, not to mention Hans Zimmer and Lisa Gerrard's rousing score, that the dramatic beats still hit as hard as they do. Maximus's speech when he takes off his helmet has been quoted to death at this point, but there's a good reason for that. When viewed in the context of the film, it remains an impactful and spine-tingling moment. All this being said, when it comes to what should have won Best Picture in 2000, I remain partial to Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which is also a triumph of cinematic spectacle, but one that carries more thematic beauty and emotional resonance for me, in addition to just absolutely kicking ass. Still, I'm certainly not mad that Gladiator won. It's a very good popcorn blockbuster, and I'm looking forward to Gladiator 2 with my countryman Paul Mescal. I don't dislike The Departed by any means, but it's hard not to be annoyed that this is the only movie by perhaps America's greatest living filmmaker to win Oscars for Best Picture and Director. From Raging Bull's infamous loss to Ordinary People in 1980, to Goodfellas coming out in the year that America was gripped by Dances with Wolves fever, it took far too long for the Academy to finally give Martin Scorsese the plaudits he deserved, and when they finally did, it was for one of his most straightforward and commercial films, neither as formally innovative as his earlier work, nor a reflective deconstruction of American mythology like his more recent movies. In a lot of ways, this feels like a Scorsese pastiche, right down to the fact that Gimme Shelter is played not just once, but twice. But hey, if I'm gonna watch somebody riffing on Marty Scorsese, it might as well be the man himself. In spite of everything I've said here, I do think The Departed is a good movie. It may be B-tier Scorsese for me, but it's a gripping and extremely well put together thriller brimming with energy and memorable dialogue.
How's your mother? Oh, she's on her way out. We all are. Act accordingly.
Jack Nicholson is giving the most Jack Nicholson performance imaginable here, which I think is something of a litmus test for whether or not you're going to vibe with the movie. You either roll with its aggressive rejection of subtlety, or it gives you a headache. Personally, I think Nicholson is really fun here, and even though the final shot is the most ridiculous and on-the-nose thing in Scorsese's entire filmography, I kinda respect that about it. For all I said about how this is Scorsese's most commercial film, it's also arguably one of his bleakest. A game of cat and mouse with no real winners or good guys, where both sides constantly think they're a step ahead of the other, before everything inevitably culminates in chaotic violence and betrayals, and nothing is truly gained by anyone. So, putting aside the fact that Scorsese should have way more Oscars than he does, do I think The Departed deserved to win Best Picture? Well, overall, no. I think Pan's Labyrinth is very easily the best movie of that year. But since it wasn't nominated, sure. I'm fine with it going to The Departed, with Little Miss Sunshine as a close second. One thing about me is that I'm a sucker for a good newspaper movie. For whatever reason, movies about intrepid reporters making phone calls, arranging secret meetings with whistleblowers, chasing false leads, and yelling righteously at their grizzled editors as they fight to expose some form of institutional corruption is just one of my favourite subgenres. So yes, all this is to say I'm quite fond of the movie Spotlight. The most common criticism levied against this movie is that the filmmaking is fairly workmanlike. I do understand this criticism. I absolutely think it's fair to say that Spotlight's cinematic presentation lacks the energy and dynamism of something like Alan J. Pakula's masterpiece All the President's Men, or even Steven Spielberg's The Post from a couple of years later. At the same time though, I really don't think a more stylized approach would have been appropriate for a movie dealing with such a delicate subject matter as child abuse. As it is, I think Spotlight is still a gripping and extremely well-paced journalism drama that handles a deeply upsetting subject with remarkable sensitivity and empathy for the victims. Director Tom McCarthy gets excellent work from his entire ensemble, including Mark Ruffalo, Rachel McAdams and Michael Keaton, although for my money the best performance in the film comes from Stanley Tucci, who deserved far more awards attention than he got. Now, while I do stand by my opinion that this movie's basic and stripped back cinematic presentation is appropriate for the subject matter it's tackling, I also think that it shouldn't have won Best Picture based on that fact. Mad Max Fury Road was pretty easily the filmmaking achievement of that year, and almost a decade later it's clearly the film from that lineup that people still talk about the most. Nevertheless, Spotlight is a very good movie, and while it's far from a fun experience, I do recommend that you give it a watch. Speaking of movies that aren't fun to watch but are still well worth seeing, 12 Years a Slave. Much like Schindler's List, Steve McQueen's film is an unflinching examination of man's cruelty to man that doesn't shy away from the deeply upsetting brutality of its subject matter, but also manages to avoid coming across as gratuitous or exploitive. It's an exceptionally difficult balance to pull off, but McQueen executes it near flawlessly, aided by an absolutely magnetic performance from Chiwetel Ejiofor. If there's one problem I have with this movie, it's producer Brad Pitt basically inserting himself into the film as the one non-racist white guy who gets to save the day. I know this character actually existed and did help Solomon secure his freedom, but Pitt clearly views the role as a showcase for what a cool guy he himself is, to the point that it's frankly distracting whenever he's on screen. Overall, I'd say 12 Years a Slave was a very deserving Best Picture winner. It may not be a movie I'd be enthusiastic to sit through again, but that's merely a testament to the devastating impact that it leaves. With some American states now actually trying to downplay the evils of slavery in their education system, a movie like this is tragically more needed than ever. Birdman is fairly divisive as Best Picture winners go, but personally, I'm in the camp that really likes it. It's a chaotic and unsubtle but darkly funny portrait of a pretentious artist unable to measure his self-worth by any metric other than how the public perceives him. Key to the movie's success is Michael Keaton. The script's jabs at celebrity culture are hardly new observations, but Keaton ensures that they land with their intended poignancy as he channels his signature live-wire energy into something devastatingly, achingly vulnerable. Nearly a decade later, I am still pissed that he didn't win Best Actor for this, especially with the win package that the movie did end up walking away with. Similarly, Emma Stone manages to craft a complex, three-dimensional human out of a role that could easily have been a broad caricature of the angsty millennial, while Edward Norton is just really fun as a self-absorbed method actor. I can understand why the conceit of the one-shot illusion struck some as gimmicky and pretentious, but I think it lends the movie a mesmerizingly dreamlike atmosphere that feels especially appropriate during the many scenes that take place inside Riggins' head. I will say that the movie loses points from me for indulging in the cheap and lazy trope of the cartoonishly evil critic, the one part where it swerves into Malcolm and Marie territory. And if you're familiar with my channel, you know that The Grand Budapest Hotel was my choice for Best Picture that year, easily. But nevertheless, I continue to count myself as a Birdman defender. The 2000s saw something of a comeback for the Hollywood musical, which had fallen rather out of fashion in the latter half of the 20th century. The success of this can be attributed to the back-to-back success of Moulin Rouge in 2001 and Best Picture winner Chicago in 2002. The latter in particular was responsible for a wave of Broadway-to-film adaptations that lasted more than a decade, and while I am on the record as being a Mamma Mia enjoyer, almost none of them could match the film that started this wave in terms of its sheer electric energy and style, not even the ones that came from the same director. Chicago is one of my favourite stage musicals, and I love what this adaptation does with the material. The decision to portray the song and dance sequences as fantasies playing out in Roxy's head is a really clever one that ties perfectly into her character's vanity and obsession with celebrity, while also allowing the movie to retain the cabaret style of the source material's musical numbers. Some may find it too stagey, but I think it's a great and creative adaptational choice. Every casting choice here is perfect. Renee Zellweger makes Roxy a tragically pathetic figure while retaining her almost childlike narcissism. Richard Gere is perfectly sleazy as Billy Flynn. John C. Reilly breaks your heart with his rendition of Mr. Cellophane, and Catherine Zeta-Jones knocks it out of the park with a performance that deservedly won her Best Supporting Actress. The musical numbers are pretty much showstopper after showstopper, although Cell Block Tango is the clear standout. It's so fucking good it'll have you saying to yourself, wait, you're telling me this guy went on to direct the Little Mermaid remake? Plus, even though the musical was written in the early 1970s, the satirical themes of the material feel just as, if not even more relevant now in an age where true crime podcasts are a massive industry. So is Chicago my favourite movie of 2002? Not quite, that would be Punch Drunk Love, but I'm still very happy that it won. Given that they tend to favour more crowd-pleasing works, it's frankly surprising that the Academy responded as well as they did to No Country for Old Men, an uncompromisingly bleak neo-western that challenges the audience with its rejection of typical storytelling conventions and ends on such a coldly nihilistic note. And yet, when you really think about the political context of the Bush era, it makes sense why a movie like this could have resonated with them. Although set in 1980, No Country for Old Men taps into the confusion and disillusionment many Americans were wrestling with in the aftermath of 9/11, with Tommy Lee Jones's character embodying the idea of someone trying to make sense of a violent, chaotic world they no longer recognize, personified by Javier Bardem's Anton Chigurh, a remorseless nihilist who has no ethos other than self-preservation and detaches himself from responsibility for his actions by placing himself at the whim of arbitrary chance. Jones's character naively pines for the seemingly more logical, clean-cut world he recalls from his youth, but he slowly comes to realize that this too was nothing more than a myth. It's difficult to say whether this is the darkest movie the Coens have made, because there's some pretty steep competition there, but it has to be in the conversation. Even with their characteristic pitch black humor, a weary sense of existential despair looms large over this one. The 2007 Best Picture lineup may honestly be the most consistently excellent selection of the century so far. 5 movies ranging in quality from very good to some of the best cinema of its era. That No Country for Old Men is only my third choice from this lineup, behind Tony Gilroy's legal thriller masterpiece Michael Clayton and Paul Thomas Anderson's modern classic There Will Be Blood, is just a testament to how strong the crop was that year. There's a scene at the beginning of James Franco's The Disaster Artist where a bunch of celebrities are talking about the cultural longevity of The Room, and Adam Scott argues that it's probably lasted longer in the public consciousness than whatever won Best Picture the year it came out, which might have been true if that movie wasn't fucking Lord of the Rings. The Return of the King is famously one of 3 movies to have tied the all-time record for most Oscar wins. And yes, that impressive sweep was partly the Academy recognizing the trilogy as a whole now that they'd seen the full thing. But Return of the King earns this honor even when taken on its own merits as an individual work. Like the previous 2 entries, it's an epic feat of blockbuster filmmaking that matches its massive scale with compelling characters and rich emotion. There are so many moments in this thing that play like gangbusters to me no matter how many times I see them. Éowyn's I am no man moment, Aragorn's speech at the Black Gate, Gandalf's reassuring pep talk to Pippin, this epic bro moment between Legolas and Gimli, Sam carrying Frodo as he succumbs to the power of the ring. When I talk about wanting to see more sincerity in my blockbusters, this is the kind of shit I'm talking about. Jackson manages to imbue even the corniest moments with this sense of majesty that just overwhelms you. It's a miracle that this movie even exists, even more so that it's as good as it is, and for that, it absolutely deserved its Best Picture win. Everything Everywhere All at Once has become an absolutely exhausting movie to talk about. I do want to say that it's not a moral failing to dislike this movie, and if you're freaking out on somebody because they dared to express valid issues with it, then you need to chill the fuck out. Which, by the way, is something the co-director of the movie agrees with me on. I'm sure the other one does as well. Anyway, I still love Everything Everywhere All at Once. I love its balls-to-the-wall creativity, its unbridled sincerity, its full-hearted rejection of cynical nihilism in an age where that's all too easy to succumb to. I don't care that its ultimate message is simplistic, or that the laundry and taxes line became overused on Twitter, because every time I watch this movie, it hits me just as hard as it did on my first viewing in the cinema. It's a genre-bending blend of comedy, science fiction, and martial arts movies that anchors its kitchen sink insanity with a moving family drama at the core of it all. Michelle Yeoh and Ke Huy Quan's Oscar wins are generally attributed to the strength of their career narratives, but I think that does a disservice to both of their performances. Yeoh is firing on all cylinders here. It's a funny, nuanced, and deeply affecting portrayal of a flawed woman going through a midlife crisis, in a role that also makes perfect use of her legendary skill as an action star. Meanwhile, Kwan manages to make each variation on his character that he plays throughout the film feel distinct from one another, but also makes it believable that they're all fundamentally the same person, in addition to selling the shit out of his big climactic monologue with his aching vulnerability and sweetness. I can't defend Jamie Lee Curtis's Best Supporting Actress win, especially because she's not even the Best Supporting Actress in the movie, but it's not like she's bad in it either, just not Oscar-worthy. 2022 was a very strong Best Picture lineup, and there are a few titles here that would have made amazing winners, but I really couldn't be happier that this won. Not only because it was my favourite movie of that year, but because it felt so thrilling to watch the Academy wholeheartedly embrace a movie this bonkers and about as far from the typical idea of Oscar bait as you can get. Even if you don't like this movie, which, again, I totally understand, you couldn't possibly accuse it of being the predictable Oscar choice, and that has to count for something. Remember that time Guillermo del Toro made a film that was basically a Universal monster movie by way of Douglas Sirk, featuring multiple scenes where Sally Hawkins gets freaky with the creature from the Black Lagoon, and it won Best Picture, and people somehow acted like it was the safe, boring, predictable choice? And then Green Book won literally a year later as if to remind people what the safe, boring, and predictable choice actually looks like? Yeah, weird times. I'm a big fan of Guillermo del Toro, so much so that I wrote my final year college dissertation on his work. The Shape of Water isn't my favourite film of his, that would be Pan's Labyrinth, but it's a movie that encapsulates why I adore his movies so much. His swooningly gorgeous visual style, his boundless passion for film history, his deep empathy for the plight of the outsider in a world that values conformity. I'll probably explore this in greater depth in a future video, but The Shape of Water is fundamentally a movie about camaraderie and solidarity between oppressed people. A movie in which a disabled woman, a gay man, a woman of colour, and a fish monster stand together against an embodiment of straight white male privilege. Del Toro's work has always been gorgeous to look at, but I particularly love how he uses the colour to tell a story here. Green and green-adjacent colours come to represent oppression and uniformity. They're heavily present in the colour palette of the consumerist world the characters inhabit. Giles's artwork that he poured his heart and soul into is rejected by his employers for not being green enough. Strickland drives around in a teal-coloured car he doesn't even like because he sees it as a status symbol. By contrast, red becomes a symbol of freedom and self-expression. In the beginning, Eliza stares longingly at a pair of red shoes in a shop window. As the film goes on and Eliza comes further and further out of her shell, she begins to wear more red clothing, until she's finally broken free from the chains of the society that she comes from. To top all this off, The Shape of Water is also a gorgeous and moving love story in which a literally voiceless woman, treated like a child by even those closest to her, finally meets someone that understands her in a way nobody else can. Cry bestiality all you want, but I think the connection that forms between Eliza and her sexy amphibian boy toy is absolutely beautiful. The 2017 Best Picture lineup is certainly a strong one, and one of the nominees just happens to be my favourite movie, so obviously that would be my pick for the winner. But I'm totally happy with The Shape of Water taking it. Okay, so I really went back and forth on the order of the top three here. All of the next three movies fit my personal criteria for the ideal Best Picture winner. Movies that explore timeless, relevant ideas in a way that doesn't feel didactic or overshadow the film's craft or artistic value. These are movies that film students can learn something from. Movies that feel appropriate as representations of their respective years, and reward subsequent viewings with new textual layers to be unpacked, in addition to feeling like they speak to the times. As such, settling on an order was not an easy task, but I think I've found one that I'm satisfied with. And so, kicking off the top three is the most recent recipient of the Oscar for Best Picture, Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. It's not often that you feel confident calling the Oscar race before summer is even over, but there was no doubt in my mind after I saw Oppenheimer in July 2023 that it would be the next Best Picture winner. This was exactly the kind of movie that used to dominate the Oscars in the 90s. A big studio production that was a massively popular commercial success in addition to being critically approved and appealing to those in the film industry. Not since Return of the King had we seen a movie that was this perfect a blend of populism and prestige, and unsurprisingly it cruised through the awards race as the almost undisputed champion when the time came. And I was very happy with that, because while Oppenheimer may not have been my personal number one of that year, it represents the platonic ideal of a Best Picture winner, as it takes full advantage of the cinematic craft to explore a chapter in human history, the ramifications of which are still felt today. Oppenheimer is Christopher Nolan's magnum opus, a biopic that initially plays into the narrative of the atomic bomb as a necessary evil before full-heartedly rejecting that in its second half, refusing to let its protagonist off the hook for the unimaginable horror he knowingly unleashed upon the world. The weight of all this communicated hauntingly through Cillian Murphy's piercing eyes. But for as heavy as this movie is, it's also a remarkably engrossing and well-paced piece of cinematic entertainment, with a flawless ensemble who all get their time to shine, and some of the most propulsive and electrifying editing I've seen in some time. Killers of the Flower Moon and The Zone of Interest are also masterpieces that would have made excellent Best Picture winners, but when trying to select a cinematic work to represent the year 2023, it's difficult to argue against Oppenheimer. Moonlight's Best Picture win tends to get overshadowed by the chaotic events that surrounded it, and I don't want to talk about that here. Everything that can be said about it has already been said. What I want to talk about instead is how incredible it is that this movie actually managed to go all the way. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences giving Best Picture to a tiny little indie with an all-black cast that interrogates ideas of identity, sexuality, and masculinity with understated empathy, never resorting to awards-baiting melodrama and breathing genuine depth into characters who would have been two-dimensional tropes in a lesser film, feels like a genuine miracle, an example of the voters actually reading the room and going with the movie that best spoke to the cultural moment, while also being exceptional on an artistic level with its gorgeous colours and haunting Nicholas Britell score. It really did feel like a sign that the Academy was beginning to evolve, that this win would herald a new wave of more interesting, diverse Best Picture winners, which, with some notable exceptions, it has. Few filmmakers since the late Jonathan Demme have used the close-up to quite as breathtaking effect as Barry Jenkins does in his work, creating a powerful sense of intimacy between his characters and the audience as they stare directly down the lens at us, their souls and vulnerabilities laid heart-wrenchingly bare. Roger Ebert famously once described cinema as a machine that generates empathy, and Jenkins is one of the directors working today who best exemplifies this, as he, a straight man, crafts one of the most beautifully authentic portraits of queer coming-of-age ever committed to the screen. Now, going purely by personal preference, my vote probably would have gone to La La Land, my own favourite movie of that year. But I can't deny that Moonlight is a more than deserving winner, and one of the most genuinely exciting choices the Academy has ever made. In fact, it would be the most exciting choice they've made maybe this century, if not for my number one pick. It's difficult to overstate just how thrilling it felt when Jane Fonda got on stage to read the final envelope at the 92nd Oscars and read out the words,
"And the Oscar goes to Parasite."
Keep in mind, this was 1 year after the Academy had given Best Picture to Green Book over Roma. So the idea that they would give it to an incisive and savage dark comedy about wealth inequality and class struggle, let alone one in a language other than English, seemed like nothing more than a pipe dream, something they'd never be cool enough to do. And yet, they did it. Just like Moonlight, Parasite's win was an incredible breath of fresh air which opened so many doors in terms of what kind of movies could take home Hollywood's biggest honour. I remember after this movie won, my non-cinephile friends at school started asking me about it, which just shows one of the most positive effects that the Oscars can have when they champion movies like this. Because as Bong Joon-ho alluded to in one of his acceptance speeches, there's really nothing inaccessible about this movie beyond the 1-inch tall barrier of subtitles. This is a film that pulls no punches in its scathing indictment of a capitalist system that pits the lower classes against one another for survival in order to maintain the status quo, but it delivers that message in the form of a wildly entertaining and unpredictable blend of hilarious comedy and almost unbearably tense thriller. What Bong pulls off here is truly remarkable. His acute sense of space as he uses the architecture of his intricately designed sets to further illustrate the status separation between the two families, his incredible command of tone as he pulls off an ambitious juggling act of genres, the almost Hitchcockian sense of suspense he creates and maintains after the mid-film turn, the pitch-perfect performances he gets out of his entire ensemble. As thrilling and history-making as this movie's Best Picture win was, it's bullshit that it didn't get any acting nominations. Song Kang-ho's inherent wily charm makes him a perfect fit for the ambitious, resourceful Mr. Kim, but it's the profound sense of weariness and sadness, eventually giving way to genuine anger and frustration visible behind his eyes as he tries to keep his family afloat, that makes his performance stick with you. Park So-dam is just a firecracker of charisma as she slips effortlessly between her character's dual personas, and Cho Yo-jung is absolutely hysterical as this neurotic, gullible embodiment of out-of-touch upper-class privilege. Like I said, choosing the number one spot was not easy, and there's a compelling argument to be made for any of the top three in my view. But ultimately I went with Parasite not just because it's a masterpiece in its own right, but because of what its win represents. Yes, the Academy has still made some regressive, annoying choices in the last 5 years, and I have no doubt that they'll make more in the years to come. But at least we now live in a world where movies like Parasite, the kinds of films that in years past would have been considered too good for the Oscars, have an honest-to-God chance at winning the accolades they deserve. It's proof that the Academy is capable of broadening their horizons, of becoming more adventurous, and so it only feels right to put it in the top spot. So that's my ranking of every Best Picture winner of the 21st century. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.